What's up, everybody? This is your boy Charismatic Lee with another episode of Talk What You Know. I'm gonna get right into it because this is going to be a long video. For a long time, people have asked me what is my problem with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Like, he was a great man, one of the astounding symbols and heroes of Black people. So, Khalee, what possible problem do you have with him? Growing up in a Black school and in a Black city and Black schools, like, yes, Dr. Martin Luther King is probably the one civil rights leader that gets like jammed down our throats the most. Like, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King. And I get it. He was a great speaker. He was charismatic. Was the face of the civil rights movement, that young, strong speaker that the movement needed, especially in the advent of TV and people having televisions in their homes and being able to see national news, and people in San Francisco now being able to see what was happening in Georgia, and people in Georgia now being able to see what was happening in New York. Whereas previously you only got radio or what you read in the newspaper. And now you got a live visual of what was going on in different areas. So the boom of television played a huge role in the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King was the perfect person to support the movement, to be a face of the movement, and said a lot of the right things that actually like create some change and help for the advancement of Black people. Having said that, Martin Luther King was always on the top of my list when it came to civil rights and like anything involving the history of Black people, especially in this country, for our fight for equality. And when I was actually 25 years old, I was in Barnes and Noble or Borders, buying something for somebody. And as I was standing in line, you see they have all the magazines and the candy, the clickbait, while you're waiting in line for you to pick up other stuff. And I saw this article on Dr. King. Time magazine, January 9th, 2006. And I was so excited that I bought 2 copies. I said I'll buy one copy that I'm never going to open and one copy that I'll read. By the way, both of them are still in mint condition. And with no further ado, I'm just going to read the actual article. So this is going to be a while, just letting you know in advance. So again, the article is called, the title of is The Secret Agony of Martin Luther King Jr., an exclusive book excerpt tells the inside story of his troubled final days. And I'm like, we always get taught about how he got killed at the motel in Memphis and in Memphis, Tennessee. But I really never knew anything. That's all we know. That's all anybody has ever taught me personally. So I was very excited and anxious to read this book excerpt. Now, the guy who wrote it, his name is Taylor Branch. And like, if you Google him, he's like one of the foremost authorities, a white guy, ironically, on chronicling Dr. King. He's written like 3 or 4 books on Dr. King, the civil rights movement, and it's pretty credible. So with no further ado, let me start reading. So this picture, the opening picture of the article, in this little box, it says "Death Foretold." At a rally the night before he was killed, the civil rights leader used the words of scripture to predict his coming martyrdom, which is kind of figurative to what I have to say at the end. But that's what the box says. All right. And it opens up, I have seen the promised land, the untold story of the turbulent final days of Martin Luther King Jr. The triumphs of the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington with its staring "I Have a Dream" speech, the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Acts, and the winning of the Nobel Peace Prize were all behind Martin Luther King Jr. when he began the last and perhaps loneliest year of his life in January 1968. Now, Black Power militants and even some of his closest advisors were rejecting King's philosophy of nonviolence. Many white supporters of the civil rights movement had redirected their enthusiasm and their dollars to opposing the war in Vietnam. Other whites chastised King for speaking out against the war. Constant travel to rally support for his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, along with his frequent affairs on the road, strained King's marriage. Premonitions of death stalked him. Meanwhile, the FBI stepped up its harassment with wiretaps and dirty tricks. Determined to revitalize his mission and himself, King hoped he could achieve both by leading a multiracial crusade against poverty. He called it the Poor People's Campaign. And although his staff had deep reservations about the idea, he spent what would be his last months planning a new march on Washington. The turbulence of King's final days comes vividly to life in Time's exclusive excerpts from At Canaan's Edge, America in the King Years, 1965 to 1968, the final volume of Pulitzer Prize winner Taylor Branch's three-part history of the civil rights movement and its most charismatic leader. In this portrait of King as a man under siege, his passion and his rhetoric reach new levels of grace. All right, here we go. Chapter 1, here's the image. Here's the second page's image. All right, so here we go. January, discontent in both his houses. King spent the early weeks of the new year flying around the country trying to drum up support for his poverty campaign, but he found one of his toughest audiences back home in Atlanta. With his aide, Andrew Young, King took a midnight flight through Dallas and reached home early on January 15th. They arrived late and exhausted for King's morning presentation at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he was the pastor. Some 60 members of the SCLC staff were gathered from scattered posts with their travel possessions, ready to disperse straight from Atlanta to recruiting assignments for the poverty campaign. Excuse me. SCLC Executive Director William Rutherford Summons had described a mandatory workshop of crisp final instructions. It is imperative, but King labored more broadly to overcome festering doubt and confusion about why they must go to Washington. He thanked his father, Daddy King, and others for filling speeches to cover his tardiness. He made a faltering joke about the tepid response of friends with their coats still on. They act like it's cold in my church, and betrayed rare unease in a defensive speech. Riots just don't pay off, said King. He pronounced them an objective failure beyond morals or faith. For if we say that power is the ability to effect change or the ability to achieve purpose, he said, then it is not powerful to engage in an act that does not do that, no matter how loud you are and no matter how much you burn. Likewise, he exhorted the staff to combat the romantic illusion of guerrilla warfare in the style of Che Guevara. No black version of the Cuban Revolution could succeed without widespread political sympathy, he asserted, and only a handful of the black minority itself favored insurrection. King extolled the discipline of civil disobedience instead, which he defined not as a right, but a personal homage to untapped democratic energy. The staff must bring to bear all of the power of nonviolence on the economic problem, he urged, even though nothing in the Constitution promised a roof or a mill. I say all these things because I want us to know the hardness of the task, King concluded, breaking off with his most basic plea. We must not be intimidated by those who are laughing at nonviolence now. By tradition, workshops close Monday night on a plenary round of music. Talk about Peter, talk about Paul, they sang in jubilant harmony, stomping their feet ahead of claps on the backbeat. Talk about Dr. King, you can't talk about them all. Long as I know I'm going to get my freedom, it's all right. Whoa, 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 it's all right. A shout from Andrew Young blocked King at the door. Don't let him out of here. And hands pulled him into a sudden chorus of happy birthday. King wore a sheepish, captured look, recorded by one home movie camera when Pioneer Television host Zernona Clayton came forward to toast his turning 39. Here we go. His affairs had been an open secret for years, but 2 weeks after his birthday, King confessed one of them to his wife, Coretta. As a newcomer, Rutherford stood at the periphery of SCLC's most private drama. He saw the swirling, teasing flirtations of its inner circle, and he discouraged prurient speculation about the link between Coretta's regal suffering and King's pursuits elsewhere. Rutherford could only guess about what he called a double life, marveling at burdens King must carry beyond the superhuman pressures and expectations of the movement. King's formidable armor wore down in midlife, draining assurance from his glib mantra as a young scholar that many great men of religion had been obsessed with sex. St. Augustine, St. Paul, Martin Luther, Kierkegaard, Tillich, and his self-reproach spilled over when Coretta underwent surgery for an abdominal tumor on January 24th. He disclosed to her, the one mistress who meant the most to him since 1963, with intensity almost like a second family, even though she lived in Los Angeles, a married alumna of Fisk, of dignified bearing like Coretta, but different. The result was painful disaster. On hearing the news, Juanita Abernathy, SCLC co-founder Ralph Abernathy's wife, exploded with the fury of a trusted second that King had picked Coretta's most vulnerable moment, just as she recovered from her hysterectomy, to ambush her sanctuary of willful silent discretion. If he was truly desperate to be honest, she said, King should purge himself privately to God or a psychiatrist. Ralph Abernathy grew so alarmed about King's confession that he canvassed the regular mistresses for hidden fits of jealousy or romantic blackmail, but he found no conventional clues to explain the rash new fatalism in King. February, a foreshadowing of martyrdom. Assassination threats were constant, and King had always been haunted by premonitions of a premature death, but now they seemed to intensify. King preached the drum major instinct at Ebenezer that Sunday, February 4th. He freely adapted a sermon published under that title during his seminary years by evangelist J. Wallace Hamilton, based on the biblical story of two disciples who beseech Jesus for the most prominent eternal seats in heaven. Their desire springs from a universal impulse for distinction, said King. This quest for recognition, this drum major instinct. An extreme drum major ends by trying to push others down to push himself up. He warned, driving racism and culture and arrogance in nations. Yet, Jesus in the Bible account does not rebuke James and John for their ambition itself, but teaches instead that true reward follows humble service. Here King's message turned. And the great issue of life, he declared, is to harness the drum major instinct. He sketched a biography of supreme Christian sacrifice with clear echoes of his own turmoil, noting that the tide of public opinion turned against Jesus when he was still young. They said he was an agitator, said King. He practiced civil disobedience. He broke injunctions. Jesus was betrayed by friends, cursed, killed, and buried penniless in a borrowed tomb. But now, after the 19th century, stands as the most influential figure that ever entered human history. For all the worldly gloss about a Lord of Lords, King found nothing royal about Jesus. He just went around serving. This was hardly the first time King flirted with martyrdom in a speech. One of the first profiles written about him during the bus boycott noted a conspicuous thread of Thanatopsis in his private conversation as well. What emerged this Sunday was a brooding reverie on external and internal burdens from the drum major instinct. And every now and then I think about my own death, he told his congregation. He gave fitful instructions for his own funeral service. Tell them not to talk too long, hoping someone would mention that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. The eulogist should admit all his honors and attainment simply to testify perhaps that King tried to love enemies, comfort prisoners, be right on the war question, and feed the hungry. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, he cried, say I was a drum for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness, and all of the other shallow things will not matter. In the thunderclap rhythm, with his distinctive voice blending ecstasy and despair, King finished the oration soon to become famous by the disembodied recording played at his funeral. March, the rise and fall of the last dream. Over the opposition of his staff, King reached out to leaders of other ethnic groups to enlist them in the Poor People's Campaign. King met with 78 non-black minority leaders on Thursday, March 14th for an anxious summit closed to reporters. Mostly known to each other, let alone to King, they ventured by invitation from across the U.S. to Paschal's Motor Lodge in the heart of Black Atlanta. Wallace, Mad Bear Anderson, spoke for a poor Iroquois confederation of upstate New York. A deputy came from the bedside of Cesar Chavez, who had barely survived a 25-day fast in penance for violent lapses by striking California farm workers. Tilly Walker and Rose Crow Flies High represented Plains tribes from North Dakota, while Dennis Banks led a delegation of Anishinaabes. Anishinaabes is spelled Anishinabes. During introductions, King aide Bernard Lafayette whispered to King what he had gleaned about basic differences among Puerto Ricans as distinct from Mexicans, Chicanos, or the defining cause of the Assiniboine. Assiniboine / Lakota leader Hank Adams, who spearheaded a drive for Northwestern salmon fishing rights. Lafayette had checked repeatedly to make sure King wanted the hard-scrabble white groups to be included, and the answer was always simple. Are they poor? The Motor Lodge's meeting room was dotted with coal miners, some of whom braved fierce criticism from Appalachian rivals, and one white participant, Peggy Terry, admitted being raised in a Kentucky Klan family. After moving to Montgomery during the bus boycott, she had gone once on a lark to see that smart aleck nigger come out of jail, and the actual sight of King buffeted by a mob had angered her. Now, Terry kept a few black friends in the Jobs or Income Now group from uptown Chicago's poor white district, and she wowed movement crowds by asking where else a hillbilly housewife could trade ideas or jail cells with a Nobel Prize winner. Black sanitation workers in Memphis were in the 10th day of a strike when supporters, including SCLC member James Lawson, staged a march. After police charged the crowd with truncheons and cans of mace, Lawson appealed for King to come. It took a flying wedge of preachers and sanitation workers to guide King's party into the cavernous Mason Temple through crowded aisles and pulsing crescendo of cheers. Against all fire codes, some spectators climbed high into rafters from which was suspended a giant white banner with a Bible quote from Zechariah. Not by might nor by power, saith the Lord of hosts, but by my spirit. The platform below teemed with dignitaries plus 3 stately new garbage cans filled with donations. When King, in his blue suit, reached the bank of microphones, the noise receded no lower than a constant hum, and applause erupted again each time he paid tribute to their unity and purpose. You are demanding that this city will respect the dignity of labor, he said. They clapped when he asked if they knew most poor people worked every day, and even cheered most sentences of his exegesis on the parable of Lazarus. You are here to demand that Memphis will see the poor, King cried. Energy in the hall brimmed so close to the surface that he backed off to summarize the previous decade. Now our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality, he resumed. There was no need to build or persuade by the rules of oratory as a feeder line in rhythm easily rekindled by the crowd. We are tired, said King. We are tired of being at the bottom. Yes, we are tired. We are tired of our men being emasculated so that our wives and our daughters have to go out and work in the white lady's kitchen. He used old riffs and improvised new ones on staying together and the nature of power. Power is the ability to achieve purpose, said King to applause. Power is the ability to effect change. And I want you to stick it out so that you will be able to make Mayor Henry Loeb and others say yes, even when they want to say no. He paused through the next ovations with a quizzical look. Now, you know what, he asked? You may have to escalate the struggle a bit. His conversational tone for once hushed the crowd. Excuse me. If they keep refusing and they will not recognize the union, said King, I tell you what you ought to do. And you are together here enough to do it. In a few days, you ought to get together and just have a general work stoppage in the city of Memphis. This time, cheers rose into sustained foot-stomping bedlam, which drowned out further words, and King stepped back into the embrace of colleagues already in furious consultation. With Lawson, Andrew Young passed King a note that perhaps he could swing back through Memphis. Temporarily, at least, the rejuvenating clamor made the garbage strike seem the heart of a poverty movement instead of a foolish diversion from the march plan for Washington. 10 days later, King returned to Memphis to participate in another march. But what unfolded not only set back the nonviolence campaign, but also set him on the path to his tragic fate. As the march swung right into Main Street for the last 10 blocks of City Hall, a surge pushed the front ranks into an uncomfortable speed, nearly a trot, jostled and patted from behind. Abernathy sensed an overly familiar hostile edge in the cries of tribute. We're glad you came to Memphis. Not long before loud pops turned anxious heads to glisten for gunshots. Crashes after the bang signaled instead the unmistakable sound of storefront windows being smashed along Beale and Main Streets. Moans went up that something was wrong. Young marauders ran through overmatched marshals to attack storefronts ahead of the march. Shaneberg's department store, York Arms Company, Perro and Lowenstein's, sometimes needing multiple blows to break the heavy plate glass. A helicopter bulletin at 11:24 a.m. reported 15 young people destroying a parked car a few hundred yards to the side, and marshals relayed shouting commands to halt the line of march. Sensing the growing emergency, Assistant Police Chief Henry Lux, marching within 20 feet of King, lent his bullhorn to James Lawson. This is Reverend Lawson speaking, shouted the voice above the chaos. I want everybody who's in the march, in the movement, to turn around and go back to the church. Lawson joined a heated debate in the middle of Main Street, surrounded by pleas for calm as well as battle cries of Black Power and burn it down, baby. King was torn between his pledge to shun violence and his promise never to abandon the movement faithful. Most others yelled to evacuate him since he presented a target of opportunity, and King aide Bernard Lee pulled King and Abernathy among swirling followers down McCall Avenue toward the Mississippi River. Lee bulled and dodged interference until he flagged down two astonished women in a Pontiac, then a police motorcycle. Lieutenant M.E. Nichols, appraising the danger by radio, avoided roadblocks already sealing off routes to the Lorraine Motel, the black-owned motel where the King entourage was staying, and escorted the Pontiac under siren to the Uptown Rivermont Holiday Inn. The FBI, which had kept King under close surveillance, wiretapped him and even inserted an undercover agent into the SCLC hierarchy, moved quickly to exploit the Memphis debacle. Federal officials disseminated to cooperative news sources a blind memorandum stating that the result of King's famous espousal of nonviolence was vandalism, looting, and riot. The lapse from nonviolent discipline in Memphis freed the FBI from the inhibitions that the public's respect for King's conduct, if not his message, had imposed, and opened the way for character assassinations on all fronts. I want to read that again. The lapse from nonviolent discipline in Memphis freed the FBI from the inhibitions that the public's respect for King's conduct, if not his message, had imposed, and opened the way for character assassinations on all fronts. Excuse me. By the next day, March 29th, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover approved a second effort to publicize hypocrisy on the part of Martin Luther King. The document whiplashed him as cowardly and violent, servile and uppity. Like Judas leading lambs to slaughter, Hoover confidentially advised news contacts. King led the marchers to violence, and when the violence broke out, King disappeared. A gossipy addition highlighted the place of refuge. The fine Hotel Lorraine in Memphis is owned and patronized exclusively by Negroes, stated the propaganda sheet, but King had chosen instead the plush Holiday Inn Motel, white-owned, operated, and almost exclusively white patronized. By April 2nd, Hoover formally requested permission to reinstall wiretaps at SCLC. 2 days later, the Mississippi FBI office sent headquarters a two-pronged counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, proposal, first, to breed confusion and resentment on King's poverty tours by spreading false information about whether he or surrogates would appear at scheduled rallies, and second, to undermine his image by distributing leaflets skewering King as a fancy dresser who deserted his people. It's not funny. I'm just laughing at how, people go hard to try to undermine us. The combination would discredit King and his aides with poor Negroes who he is seeking support from, argued Mississippi. But the Bureau would not have time to act on the plan. April, into the Valley of Death. Back in Atlanta, an emergency meeting of SCLC leaders was convened to discuss the Memphis riot. Criticisms were hurled at King, and he was urged to abandon the sanitation strikers. King absorbed the raw speeches mildly, as was his custom, then rose from a wooden Sunday school table to argue that they all underestimated their problem. "We are in serious trouble," he said. The Memphis riot had discredited nonviolent tenets at the heart of their movement. If they simply abandoned the garbage strike, a presumption of violence would follow them to the national stage with greatly magnified risk and opposition. Therefore, said King, he felt by no means committed to either Memphis or Washington, regardless of what he told the press, unless first convinced that they could restore the integrity of nonviolent protests. This was a staff decision because he could not do it alone. I want to read that again. This was a staff decision because he could not do it alone. Memphis is the Washington campaign in miniature, he said. His appeal backfired by reopening dissent against the Washington campaign itself. Andrew Young warned that the whole plan might be moot for the year anyway, as the tangled logistics could well push the start back into June, when the summer recess of Congress would deprive them of faro rollers to play. Young proposed to make constructive use of delay and questioned the enormous effort to assemble and maintain a novel protest army of polyglot poor people in Washington. Or is it polyglot? Polyglot or polyglot poor people in Washington is spelled Polyglot. I've never seen this word. I've never read this far into the article. This is very interesting. Where was I? He doubted King's white attorney and closest confidant Stanley Levison's analogy with the bonus marchers of 1932 through 1934, whose suffering and rejection had kindled delayed support for New Deal initiatives. And King aide James Bevel renewed his attack on the entire calculation. "Oh, that's just a bunch of bullshit," he declared. "We don't need to be hanging around Washington. We need to stop this war." Bevel described Vietnam as a political sickness more deeply rooted than poverty, and his rhetoric bristled with street militancy poised ingeniously at the limit of nonviolence. Jesse Jackson, like Bevel, excelled in slashing vocabulary that suggested a competitive preacher's chops better suited to the new moods than King's ecumenical language. ECUMENICAL, ecumenical. Jackson called Memphis too small and Washington too unformed. So here we see, according to this article, that Jesse Jackson didn't agree with the march in Memphis. This time, King stood seething. "Ralph, give me my car keys," he said quietly. Ralph, give me my car keys, he said quietly. Abernathy surrendered them with a stricken, quizzical look as King said they can go on without him. He did something I've never heard him do before, Levison confided afterwards on his wiretap phone. He criticized 3 members of the staff with his eloquence. And believe me, that's murder, and was very negative. King said Young had given into doubt, Bevel to brains, and Jackson to ambition. He said they have forgotten the simple truths of witness. He said the movement had made them, and now they were using the movement to promote themselves. He confronted Bevel, who had been a mentor to Jackson and Young, as a genius who flummoxed his own heart. You don't like to work on anything that isn't your idea. Don't we all know people like that, said King. You don't like to work on anything that isn't your idea, said King. Bevel, I think you owe me one. Abernathy, Jackson, and Young rushed after King. Doc, don't worry, called Jackson in the stairwell. Everything's going to be all right. King whirled on the landing and pointed up to shout, Jesse, everything's not going to be all right. He cried. If things keep going the way they're going now, it's not SCLC, but the whole country that's in trouble. I'm not asking, support me. I don't need this. But if you're so interested in doing your own thing that you can't do what this organization's structured to do, if you want to carve out your own niche and in society, go ahead. But for God's sake, don't bother me. His fury echoed in the conference room. Chagrined by King's reprimand, the SCLC leaders agreed to return to Memphis, despite the mayor's petitioning the federal court to ban the organization from a march planned for the following week. The evening before the case was to be argued, supporters held a rally at which they expected King to speak. Tornado warnings made King fret about his crowd, as ominous streaks of gray and purple crossed the sky from the west. Radio bulletins told of a 7 o'clock twister that picked up and dumped a stretch of asphalt on cars near Star City, Arkansas, killing 7 people, and the first squalls hit Memphis half an hour later in slanted sheets of rain. Phone calls from the Lorraine to Lawson and Mason Temple verified that the crowd indeed was thin, perhaps fewer than 2,000 in the huge hall that had packed 7 times that many for King's visit on March 18th. He feared the sharp drop-off would invite belittling stories of a downward trend for him, along with the riot and new federal injunction. Ralph, said King, I want you to go speak for me tonight. Murmurs of anticipation ran through the hall when Abernathy, Jackson, and Young were cited, only to hush when King's absence registered. For Abernathy, a keen reader of crowds, the palpable disappointment was worse than he feared. He went to a vestibule telephone instead of the podium and marshaled enticements for King, mentioning news cameras, the big spray of microphones, and Lawson's point that the movement seldom gathered so many people in the South. Most of all, Abernathy told King this was a core crowd of sanitation workers who had braved a night of hellfire to hear him, and they would feel cut off from a lifeline if he let them down. When King gave in, Abernathy pressed for assurance. Don't fool me now, he said, and King promised to hurry. His entrance caused an eerie bedlam of communion under shelter. Let me read that again, I apologize. His entrance caused an eerie bedlam of communion under shelter. Cheers from the floor echoed around thousands of empty seats above, and the whole structure rattled from the pounding elements of wind, thunder, and rain. King came smiling to the microphones about 9:30, just as the storms crested. He strung together several of his speech themes aimed toward the shared moment, beginning with a poetical tour of history. Then he meandered into another speech theme to recap the parable of the Good Samaritan. If I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, he concluded, what will happen to them? That's the question. We have an opportunity to make America a better nation, and I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you. Abruptly, King swerved into a third oratorical run, retelling of his brush with death when a demented woman stabbed him at a Harlem bookstore in 1958. How a doctor told the New York Times that the blade would have severed his aorta if he so much as sneezed, and how a little girl wrote a simple letter of thanks that he did not sneeze. I want to say that I am happy that I didn't sneeze, said King, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, They were really standing up for the best in the American dream and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy. His voice climbed again in rhythm and fervor, using survival as a melodramatic device to relive the civil rights movement. If I had sneezed, he cries near the end, I wouldn't have been down in Selma. Experienced preachers behind him felt fleeting anxiety that King might miss his landing because he was in full passion on a peroration unsuited to close. The sneeze run always came earlier in his speeches, but being informal and thin. King sputtered at the podium, then slipped a gear. And they were telling me, now it doesn't matter now, he said. Excuse me. It really doesn't matter. I left Atlanta this morning. He told briskly of the bomb scare of his plane and how the pilot had announced that threats to King had generated a precautionary overnight guard for the aircraft. And then I got into Memphis. He frowned. And some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What will happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now. King paused. Because I've been to the mountaintop, he declared in a trembling voice. Cheers and applause erupted. Some people jerked involuntarily to their feet, and others rose slowly like a choir. And I don't mind, he said, trailing off beneath the second and third waves of response. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. The whole building suddenly hushed, which let sounds of thunder and rain fall from the roof. But I'm not concerned about that now, said King. I just want to do God's will. There was a subdued call of yes in the crowd, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, King cried, building intensity. And I've looked over, and I have seen the promised land. His voice searched a long peak over the word seen, then hesitated and landed with a quick relief on the promised land, as though discovering a friend. He stared out over the microphones with brimming eyes and a trace of a smile. And I may not get there with you, he shouted, but I want you to know tonight, yes, that we as a people will get to the promised land. He stared again over the claps and cries while the preachers closed toward him from behind. So I'm happy tonight, rushed King. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He broke off of the quotation and stumbled sideways into a hug from Abernathy. The preachers helped him to a chair. Some crying, a tumult washed through the Mason Temple. On April 4th, as hearings were held to determine whether SCLC could participate in the upcoming march, King and several other SCLC leaders waited at the Lorraine Motel for the decision. So this is going into the last page of the article. Here's the leaders. And it says, King is joined by, from the left, Hosea Williams, Jesse Jackson, and Ralph Abernathy on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, where he would be assassinated the next day. All right, here we go. At 4 o'clock, an escaped convict bought a pair of Bushnell binoculars just up Main Street at York Arms Company, one of the businesses whose windows were smashed on March 28th. He drove back to finish setting up a surveillance post. The convict had driven from Atlanta, where the newspaper said King was leaving for a march in Memphis, arriving late the previous night. This day, reading front page news that King was staying at the Lorraine and perhaps hearing radio reports that specified room 306, he had located and studied the motel until an hour ago, when he rented a room for $850 per week in Bessie Brewer's flop house next door to the fire station number 2. With the 7 power Bushnells, he could read room numbers on the motel doors 70 yards distant, and the same strength on his Redfield scope would make human figures seem only 30 feet away. The scope was mounted on a 30-06 Remington Game Master, which was engineered so that its 150 grain slug would lose less than 0.01 inch in altitude and reach the motel balcony with 2,370 pounds of knockdown power, enough to drop a rhinoceros. However, the odd angle of and including building next door meant the convict could fire the long rifle only by leaning out of his window. To avoid that, he must wait until he sighted his target from the room, then run with the rifle down the hallway to the common bathroom, find it unoccupied, and hope King stayed long enough on the balcony to get a clear shot from a rear window above the bathtub. Excuse me. About 5 o'clock, when Andrew Young returned from his courtroom testimony to find the General Bull session and visiting Kentucky State Senator Georgia Davis Powers' room 201, King greeted him with a playful fury by wrestling him to the floor between the two beds. Abernathy, SCLC member Hosea Williams, Bernard Lee, and King's brother Eddie King joined in a wild tickling punishment of Young for failure to keep our leader informed all day, which turned into a free-for-all pillow fight, with King sometimes squaring off against AD, as in childhood. Once the hysteria subsided, Young said he thought the hearing went pretty well. Chauncey Eskridge walked in from a lawyer's conference with Judge Bailey Brown and said the judge would permit SCLC to lead Monday's march under the restrictions King and Lawson desired: a prescribed route, no weapons, and narrow ranks to give the marshals wide space on the flanks to keep the spectators away. This relief started a fresh buzz of determination for weekend preparations. They should all get ready for dinner at the home of Reverend Billy Kyles, a well-known Memphis minister, King said, and Officer Richmond, a Memphis policeman keeping King under surveillance, noted through binoculars at 5:40 his brisk walk with Abernathy upstairs to their room 306. While dressing, Abernathy disclosed sheepishly to King that he could not join him in Washington for the preliminary lobbying in the Poor People's Campaign because the new start date of April 29th conflicted with his long-scheduled spring revival at his West Hunter Street Baptist Church in Atlanta. King said this would never do. Abernathy's congregation was a magnificent one already, he purred, claiming that he would have gone there himself if Daddy King had not invited him to Ebenezer. And surely the deacons would understand that Abernathy had to revive the soul of a whole nation instead. Abernathy weakened, but did not give in until King promised to help secure a substitute revival leader of stature. Upstairs, Hosea Williams, and I apologize if I'm saying his name incorrectly, is spelled Hosea. Upstairs, Hosea Williams loudly evicted the last of the invaders, a gang accused of being agent provocateurs in the riot, from two rooms provided during negotiations after discovering to his outrage that 15 of them had crammed inside to live on meals charged to the SCLC account. I'm going to read that one again. Upstairs, Hosea Williams loudly evicted the last of the invaders, a gang accused of being agent provocateurs in the riot, from two rooms provided during negotiations after discovering to his outrage that 15 of them had crammed inside to live on meals charged to the SCLC account. Downstairs, Jesse Jackson rehearsed a singing group from a Chicago-based program, Operation Breadbasket, and bystanders crowded into the room to belt out extra hymns such as Yield Not to Temptation and I'm So Glad, Trouble Don't Last Always. Reverend Kyles left Jackson's Songfest and knocked at room 306 to Harry King alone. Abernathy played him for a sign of deliverance. Here we go. Why don't you do my revival? He asked Kyles, who adroitly dodged, saying he thought he was scheduled to preach in Columbus, Ohio. King chimed in to needle Kyles about the relative status of his invitations. Anybody'd rather come to Atlanta than go to Columbus, he said. He shifted tone to inquire how Memphis churches achieved such unity behind the sanitation workers who were not members of the prestige congregations, but Abernathy reopened preachers' banter on the subject of food, making clear his preference for soul food over fancier fare. All right now, Billy, I don't want you fooling me, he said, warning that if he went all the way to the Kyles' home for T-bone steaks or filet mignons, which he pronounced filet mignons, then you're going to flunk. Now Billy said, King, if you bought this big new house and can't afford to feed us, I'm going to tell everybody in the country. Kyle's rejoined that there would be more soul food than King's waistline needed. Your wife can't cook anyway, King teased. She's too good looking. He fell into a chauvinist bromide about the value of plain wives, and Abernathy took up the flip side with remarks on the beauty of Gwen Kyles. He retreated to the bathroom with a flirtatious grin that he must splash on Aramis cologne just for her. King walked ahead of Kyles to look over the handrail outside, down on a bustling scene in the parking lot. Police undercover agent Morel McCullough, a mole in the entourage, parked almost directly below, returning with SCLC staff members James Orange and James Bevel from a shopping trip to buy overalls. Orange unfolded his massive frame from McCullough's little blue Volkswagen, tussling with Bevel, and Andrew Young stepped up to rescue Bevel by shadow boxing at a distance. King called down benignly from the floor above for Orange to be careful with preachers half his size. McCullough and Orange walked back to talk with two female college students who pulled in just behind them. Jesse Jackson emerged from the rehearsal room, which reminded King to extend his rapprochement. Jesse, I want you to come to dinner with me, he said. And I lost my place, but I got it back. All right, final two paragraphs. Kyles, overhearing on his way down the balcony stairs, told King not to worry because Jackson already had secured his own invitation. Abernathy shouted from room 306 for King to make sure Jackson did not try to bring his whole breadbasket band, which Chauncey Eskridge was telling Jackson he should upgrade from turtleneck to necktie for dinner. Jackson called up to King. Doc, you remember Ben Branch? He said Breadbasket's lead saxophonist and song leader was a native of Memphis. Oh, yes, he's my man, said King. How are you, Ben? Excuse me, Branch waved. King recalled his signature number from Chicago. Ben, make sure you play Precious Lord. Take my hand in the meeting tonight, he called down. Play it real pretty. Okay, Doc, I will. Solomon Jones, the volunteer chauffeur, called up to bring coats for a chilly night. There was no reply. Time on the balcony had turned lethal, which left hanging the last words fixed on a gospel song of refuge. King stood still for once, and his sojourn on the earth went blank. And here you have the famous picture titled The Deepest Grief. Coretta Scott King in the rear and her four young children at the funeral service. So let's talk about this. This is the January 9th, 2006 issue of Time magazine entitled The Secret Agony of Martin Luther King Jr. That's the first time I ever read this entire article because I always stopped at the part where he told Coretta about his cheating all over the country. He's from Atlanta, and he told her about his girlfriend and his family there in LA, in California, who he'd been dealing with for at least 5 years. Then his right-hand man went to holler at the other mistresses that he knew of to make sure that they wasn't plotting anything. Like, it got real. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. So we hear everything else. How, first of all, before we even talk about the article, based on all that information that you just heard, do you even think that this article is credible? I have no reason to discredit it. I'm sure all this stuff has been researched thoroughly, or person was there, or all this stuff can be backed up. If it's lies, it probably would have been discredited a long time ago. This came out 2006. It's 2020. It was 14 years ago, and the book was written prior to that. We would have smashed it a long time ago. So I'm saying that I think that this information is credible. If it's not, maybe it'll come out someday. But based on what I see, it seems credible to me. He knew the people who were there, and he was very vivid about things that occurred. I understand that when a person is at the top or near the top, a lot of shenanigans occur. I understand that being a leader requires, well, like with being a leader comes a lot of perks, but it also comes a lot of responsibility. I understand that there was a lot of pressure on him. What I didn't know before I read this article, even right now, that the civil rights movement was dying. We'd never been taught that in school. He was losing momentum. Like a lot of people was like stopping messing with him. People wasn't feeling the whole nonviolent thing. People wanted violence. A whole riot broke out in Memphis because black people were tired. And by the way, I don't say African American. I hate that term. I hate it. We black. Black people were tired and they were frustrated and they just let downtown Memphis have it. I don't know. I get it. Like back then with the advent of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover was running wild. They had to put laws in place because of what the FBI and the CIA was doing. They were wiretapping people. Dude had wiretaps on people all over the country, including the president. You know, if he was alive, you know how much stuff he has on JFK? Those tapes exist somewhere, unless somebody destroyed them. But he had a lot of tapes on everybody. And he had this, according to the article, this particular disdain against King, probably because he was black. Wiretapped him a lot. So we can only imagine all the stuff that he really had on him. And maybe he let King know. And like, that's pressure. Be like, yo, dude, I'm gonna expose you. The entire South knew about what King was doing. Can you imagine if social media existed in the 60s? He would have never became who he was. And even if he did, he would have got smashed. The court of public opinion would have thrashed him. We saw what happened to Kobe Bryant just passed away last week. We saw what happened to Kobe when he got caught cheating. Like, we ripped him apart. And he was just a basketball player. We're talking about the leader of change, the face of the civil rights movement. The whole thing would have got discredited if the world would have found out about that. These guys, like Dr. King and his team, was like around the country. They were the athletes and the entertainers of their day. They was going around the country knocking down anything that moved. Period. All of them. They was getting it in. And everybody knew about it. Except maybe Coretta, but she probably knew too. My problem is, because you hear all the things. You're like, a man gonna be a man. He was just a man. My problem is, when we refer to Martin Luther King, we say the whole thing, right? We say Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And if and when you take either religion or spirituality, or let's scratch both of those and just say you take God seriously. To be a reverend or to be the leader of a flock, to be the shepherd, whether you get ordained or you get called upon, it is a responsibility and it is a position that people accept. I'm quite sure that there are people who have turned down leadership and turned down the reverendhood, and they do what they do, and that's fine. That's your option. But when you accept that, see, my problem with Dr. King is, I want to say, not that he cheated on his wife, even though that's not cool, but we won't get into all that because we all sin and we're all sinners. My problem that he was a reverend on such a high platform as he was and cheating on his wife. So this whole religious thing that was kind of like helping to push things along, like, oh, he's Dr. King, he's a great speaker, he's the face of the civil rights movement, and he's a man of God, and he leads the flock. He is up on the pulpit every Sunday at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and he is the man. He is everything that we need to push black people along. And to come to find out that that was all a fraud, that wasn't J. Edgar Hoover. That wasn't the pressure on him. I mean, the pressure might have led to what he was doing, but that was them being them. That was the hood, because they all from the hood. That was the hood doing what they do. You leave your wives, you left your girlfriends, you're off in another city, the ladies are throwing themselves at you, and they was knocking them down. And that's cool? Like, all right, so my thing is, I go through 24 years, 25 years of more or less worshiping Dr. King, because he's the greatest civil rights leader who ever lived. Like, without him, we would still be in the 60s. And to find out I get this new information that it was all a fraud? Like, really? So, like, what am I supposed to do with this new information? What are you supposed to do with this new information? It's for you to decide, but new information always influences new ideas, maybe a different route. So I get it. You're like, yo, you can't. I'm not judging them. I'm just saying I received new information. Bill Cosby, we received new information. He was raping women. So people are like, well, that doesn't take away from his show. Yes, it does. I don't want to watch his show. I don't want him in my house. Listen, if you slip something in anybody's drink without them knowing and then having sex with them while they're under the influence of what you slipped in their drink, that's rape. It doesn't matter if everybody else was doing it. It doesn't matter if all the white guys were doing it too. He was doing it. He was doing it willingly. Jerry Sandusky. People are like, well, yeah, Dr. King was cheating on his wife, but it doesn't take away from all the great things he did. Jerry Sandusky did a lot for black people. Like when the news first broke, they were interviewing the players that he coached on defenses. And a lot of the black guys were like, yo, that's my coach. I never had a problem with him. Like, he did a lot for me. I needed help. He helped me. So these allegations, I don't know anything about. But this new information, you found out that he was sodomizing teenagers and boys? Like, what's that? So what do you do with that information? What do you do with information when you find out Harvey Weinstein? You know how many people he helped? A lot. Come to find out, a lot of the people he helped were women who he was forcing to knock them down, and then he put them in movies and made them rich. What do you do with that information? Like, yeah, he made me rich, which is what I wanted, but he raped me. Like, what do you do with that information? That's my thing. That's my issue with Dr. King. While I don't promote him and am not all rah-rah like all the rest of black people who don't have this information. So now what do you do with it? Whew. So I'm sorry for the, I know this is probably the longest video ever, but I mean, I'm curious if you sat here with me through this whole hour, what's your opinion? This is your boy Khalee, Charismatic Lee. I'm just talking what I know. Get at me.